A cold voice cut through the stillness of first class. "I don't care what your ticket says. I am not giving up this seat." The cabin froze for a beat. Crystal champagne flutes trembled slightly on their trays. The words of the blonde woman landed like a blade, slicing through the carefully curated silence of luxury. Ethan Cole, 40 and 5, tall and broad, shouldered in a simple blue shirt under a light blazer, stood motionless in the aisle. In his hand was a boarding pass printed clearly with 1A. But sitting there, legs crossed as though she owned the entire plane, was Susan Drake. 42. Radiating imperious confidence. Her perfectly coiffed golden hair shimmered under the lights, and on the armrest sat a blazing red Hermes bag, a declaration in itself. She flipped through Vogue with fingers weighed down by jeweled rings, her face so detached it could make anyone hesitate. "Excuse me. Perhaps you are mistaken," Ethan said in a calm, steady tone. He had long mastered the art of controlling every word and every breath, honed in hundreds of high-stakes boardroom confrontations across America. "This is my seat." Susan lifted her eyes, grey and cool, and looked at him as though he were out of place. "This is 1A, and I am already sitting here. I arrived first." The arrogance in her reply left nearby passengers in silence. None of them realized this small confrontation would soon spiral into a storm that could shake an entire airline. First class gleamed in warm gold lighting. Every detail was designed for ease: wide leather seats, fine wines, steaming hot towels. Yet for Ethan, those details only underscored the injustice pressing in around him. He had endured a grueling week of back-to-back negotiations, lavish dinners, cold handshakes, calculating eyes. All of it had left him craving a few quiet hours on this flight. He had booked seat 1A 3 weeks earlier, and now, because of the color of his skin and his modest attire, he was being treated as though he didn't belong. Susan casually adjusted the Chanel scarf draped across her chair, lips curling in a faint smirk. In her mind, the situation was obvious. A black man must have made a mistake with his seat. If he were polite, he would step aside and move elsewhere. She was certain of it, because in her life, Susan had never been forced to leave any place she claimed as hers. But Ethan did not move. He stood firm, eyes steady, boarding pass clutched tightly in his hand. Whispers rose behind him. A gentleman in row 2 leaned toward his wife and muttered, "Here we go again. This will take an hour to sort out." None of them knew that the man holding his ground was not just a weary traveler. He was one of the most powerful shareholders in the airline industry. A flight attendant approached. Sarah Miller, 33, blonde hair neatly tied back, her professional smile polished from years of service. Yet when her eyes flicked across Ethan, that smile faltered for an instant. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked gently, though her tone already implied who was causing trouble. Susan spoke quickly. "This man insists on taking my seat. I have been sitting here since boarding." Sarah nodded, as if everything were clear. She did not ask for Susan's boarding pass, nor did she check the manifest. Instead, she turned to Ethan, her voice laced with strained patience. "Sir, to avoid inconvenience for the other passengers, would you be willing to accept seat 12B in business class? We can refund the difference." The words hit Ethan like an invisible slap. He had paid for fairness, yet the assumption was that he should yield. He inhaled deeply, his tone low but firm. "I purchased seat 1A, and I will sit in seat 1A. The whispers grew louder. "Why doesn't he just give it up?" "It's just a seat." Sweat glistened on Sarah's forehead, her smile rigid. She exchanged a desperate glance with a colleague. The air in the cabin grew dense, taut as a violin string stretched to breaking. Susan crossed her arms and leaned back, a smug smile curling on her lips. In her mind, the outcome was certain. This man would be forced to step aside. But she was wrong. Because Ethan Cole was not just a tired passenger. He was the man who held the power to decide the fate of thousands of employees in this airline. A man who had grown weary of being underestimated. And this time, he would not retreat. What began as a dispute over seat 1A was about to ignite into a battle that would shake the skies. The air in first class was thick, heavy with the weight of an oncoming storm. Every gaze locked on Ethan Cole, the tall man still standing firm in the aisle, clutching a boarding pass that clearly read 1A. Below him, Susan Drake lazily flipped through her magazine, lips curled into a defiant smile, as though everything had already been decided. Footsteps echoed steadily down the aisle. David Harmon, the 41-year-old purser with neatly combed graying hair, approached with practiced confidence. He had handled hundreds of in-flight disputes before, from drunken outbursts to screaming couples. He believed that with a bit of authority and charm, this too would soon be resolved. "Good evening, sir." David glanced briefly at Ethan, then quickly shifted his gaze with warm familiarity toward Susan. "I understand there is some confusion about the seating." Ethan met his eyes, his own gaze sharp and unwavering. "There is no confusion. I booked and paid for seat 1A 3 weeks ago." David tilted his head, his thin smile unwavering. "I understand. But Mrs. Drake here is one of our long-standing Gold Elite members. For years we have prioritized her comfort." Around the cabin, a few passengers nodded, as though David's words had transformed Susan's act of taking the seat into a legitimate privilege. But Ethan let out a soft, cold laugh. "Gold Elite?" His voice lowered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I am Diamond Elite, and I am not asking for special treatment. I just want to sit in the seat I paid for." David's face stiffened. He hadn't expected this plainly dressed man to outrank Susan in status. For a fleeting moment, hesitation crossed his face. But instinctively protecting the familiar passenger, he turned back to Susan. "Ma'am, would you kindly present your boarding pass?" Susan laughed outright, the sound slicing through the tension like a blade. "Mr. Harmon, don't be ridiculous. I have sat in this seat dozens of times. You all know me. No paperwork needed." Ethan narrowed his eyes, studying their reactions closely. Anger pulsed through him, not because of the seat itself, but because arrogance was being sanctioned by the very crew tasked with fairness. David shifted his tone, this time addressing Ethan directly, soft but edged. "Mr. Cole, I believe we can find a reasonable solution. There is a seat available in business class, and we are willing to offer complimentary services as compensation. Please understand, we must consider the comfort of all 200 passengers on this flight." Ethan felt the truth crystallize. This man wasn't standing for what was right. He was standing for the blonde woman in seat 1A. He gripped the boarding pass tighter, his voice cutting through the cabin, deliberate and unyielding. The only reasonable solution is for her to vacate my seat. The murmurs behind him grew louder. A man in row 2 muttered in frustration, "For God's sake, it's just a seat. Does it really need to be such a spectacle?" The words poured fuel on the smoldering fire. Susan leaned back into her chair, satisfied as the crowd began tilting toward her side. Sarah, the flight attendant from earlier, stood beside David, her face tight with tension, her eyes cold as they fell on Ethan. In her mind, he was the problem. Ethan swallowed hard, memories crashing back, dinners where he was overlooked, meetings where his ideas were dismissed until repeated by a white colleague. Every slight and every dismissal converged on this moment, when he, a man who had paid fairly like anyone else, was treated as if he didn't belong. Suddenly, he shifted tactics. Locking eyes with David, his voice dropped low and commanding. "If you truly want to resolve this, start with the most basic step. Ask her to show her boarding pass." The word struck like an unexpected counterpunch. For a split second, David and Sarah faltered. They had blatantly ignored the simplest protocol, checking both passengers' tickets. Yet they did not answer immediately. Instead, David arched an eyebrow, clinging to control. "Mr. Cole, please cooperate. This is not the time to make things more complicated." Ethan smiled, sharp as a blade. "Complicated? You call asking for proof complicated? Or is it complicated because you fear the truth won't support the person you're protecting?" The cabin erupted with stunned silence. Passengers stared wide-eyed. Some nodded subtly, beginning to sense the absurdity of the crew's actions. For a fleeting moment, Susan's smug mask cracked, uncertainty flashing in her eyes. The tide was beginning to turn. And Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The steady sound of footsteps echoed across the thick carpet of first class. The cockpit door swung open, revealing the tall frame of Captain Robert Hayes. 50. 5. Silver streaks at his temples. 4 gold stripes on his shoulders, glinting under the cabin lights. The moment he appeared, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Passengers straightened in their seats. The crew adjusted their posture. The authority of the cockpit carried the weight of an unspoken command. Robert stopped at the first row. His eyes swept the cabin, finally resting on Ethan Cole. But there was no curiosity in his gaze, only judgment. "Sir," his voice boomed, steady as a bell, "we have over 200 passengers waiting to depart. I need you to cooperate with the crew and resolve this matter immediately." Every word of "cooperate" fell like a hammer on Ethan's head. It wasn't an invitation to negotiate, but an order wrapped in polite diplomacy. Ethan clutched his boarding pass tighter, answering calmly, "I'm more than willing to cooperate, Captain. I only ask to sit in the seat I paid for, seat 1A. He stressed the words. Seat 1A. First class rumbled with annoyed whispers. A woman in row 2 sighed loudly. "Honestly, does he really have to be so stubborn? We want to get to Los Angeles, too." Robert seized on that support, turning back, his voice dropping lower, laced with threat. "Mr. Cole, my crew has offered several reasonable alternatives. A business class seat, a refund, complimentary services. Yet your continued refusal is obstructing this flight. I have the authority, under federal regulations, to remove any passenger whose actions threaten the safety or schedule of this flight. The last words crashed like thunder. In an instant, Ethan felt dozens of eyes pierce him, heavy, irritated, condemning. In Susan Drake's mind, triumph surged. She leaned back into the seat, lips curled, thinking, "Finally, the seat is mine. No black man can defy the authority of a captain." Sarah, the blonde flight attendant, stood just behind Robert, her eyes blazing, waiting for the nod to summon security. David Harmon folded his arms, feigning regret, but the corners of his mouth betrayed his satisfaction. Ethan drew in a deep breath. His heartbeat pounded hot and fast, but outwardly, he remained eerily calm. "Captain," he said slowly, each word falling heavy as lead, "I am not disruptive. I have broken no law. I am asking for one simple thing. Check the boarding passes for both of us. If Mrs. Drake truly holds the ticket for seat 1A, I will step aside immediately. But if she does not—" He paused, eyes locked on Robert. "Then this delay is not caused by me." A suffocating silence spread. Robert frowned, hesitation flickering across a face more accustomed to giving orders than listening. He knew Ethan was right. Yet deep down, years of habit had conditioned him to assume the elegant blonde woman was the proper passenger. Susan quickly cut in, her voice tinged with drama. "Captain, I honestly don't feel safe sitting next to this man. He's aggressive, pressuring your crew. We can't take the risk." A small murmur rippled through a few passengers. The "I feel unsafe" card, Ethan had seen it too many times. It was a blade aimed straight at his image, flipping the victim into the threat. Robert nodded slightly, almost by reflex. His hand moved toward the radio on his shoulder. One press, and security would be there. In that instant, time seemed to freeze. Ethan heard every thump of his heart, every fragmented whisper behind him. "Just give in already. What kind of man makes such a fuss over this?" But instead of panic, a cold fire coursed through him. A sharp, controlled fury. Enough, Ethan thought. Enough to tear this entire system wide open. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The glow of the screen lit his calm face. Some passengers widened their eyes, expecting him to call a lawyer. But no. He pressed a number, his voice ringing out, steady, authoritative. "Hello? Activate Protocol 7. Flight 1847. Immediately." First class fell into utter silence. No one understood what Protocol 7 meant, but the way he said it sent chills down Sarah's and David's spines. Robert faltered, suspicion flickering in his eyes. He had never seen a passenger dare challenge him like this, and in that moment, a secret began to leak. Ethan Cole was not just another traveler. He was a man whose single phone call could shake the entire airline. The static crackle of the radio filled the air. Robert Hayes had sent the signal. Just minutes later, the cabin door opened and 2 blue uniforms stepped inside. Officer Johnson, 40, 4 white, moved with heavy steps, his hand resting firmly on the radio clipped to his belt. His cold eyes scanned the cabin, locking on Ethan Cole as if the verdict had already been decided. Beside him was Officer Martinez, 32, Latino-American. His steps were lighter, his gaze sharp and measured, withholding judgment. First class held its breath. Some passengers leaned back in their seats, satisfied that order was about to be restored. Susan Drake adjusted her silk scarf, lips curling with a smirk. In her mind, victory was already hers. Johnson stepped forward, his voice deep and hard. "Sir, the crew has asked you repeatedly to cooperate. If you do not comply, we will have to escort you off this plane immediately." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Finally, they're handling it. This has taken too long already. But Ethan stood tall, calm eyes steady. He looked directly at Johnson. "I'm ready to cooperate. But before you do that, tell me this. Has anyone here checked both of our boarding passes?" The question crashed into the cabin like a stone dropped into still water. Silence. David Harmon glanced at Sarah Miller. Both stayed mute, their faces betraying a flicker of unease. Martinez furrowed his brow, stepping closer. "That's right," he said, his voice steady yet commanding. "I want to know too. Has anyone actually checked this passenger's boarding pass and hers?" The silence deepened. Susan gave a dismissive laugh, lifting her chin. "Officer, I've sat in this seat many times. The crew knows me. There's no need to check." Martinez did not move. His eyes locked on Susan's hands, clutching her purse. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The most basic procedure in a seat dispute is to verify boarding passes. I need to see yours." For a moment, she hesitated. Then Susan slowly opened her bag, every movement strangely sluggish. Her fingers trembled, fumbling longer than necessary. Her eyes flickered with unease. Ethan caught that moment and knew the lie was about to be exposed. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, whispers fading into confusion. Finally, Susan pulled out a boarding pass, handing it to Martinez with a strained smile. He took it, glanced once, then read aloud, his voice striking like a hammer. "Seat 14F, economy class." The cabin erupted. Gasps filled the air. A few mouths hung open. A man blurted out, "Oh my God!" Susan's face drained of color. The smug smile vanished, replaced by shock, then fury. She opened her mouth to speak, but Martinez's stare silenced her. Robert Hayes froze. He realized he had just backed a blatant lie, nearly ejecting a rightful passenger. David Harmon dropped his gaze. Sarah Miller turned quickly away, desperate to avoid the judgment now radiating from every corner of the cabin. Ethan relaxed his shoulders, his cold eyes sweeping across the room. He didn't need to say a word. The truth had spoken for itself. But inside, he knew the storm had only begun. This was never just about a seat. It was living proof of a system tilted toward blind trust in a blonde woman and blind suspicion of a black man fighting to claim what was rightfully his. Ethan tilted his head slightly, a thin smile crossing his lips. He knew that now, not just Susan, not just the crew, but the entire airline would pay the price for this moment that seemed so small, yet carried the weight of an empire. First class remained frozen in silence after the truth had exploded. The boarding pass marked 14F sat limp in Officer Martinez's hand, undeniable evidence of deceit. Every gaze locked onto Susan Drake, whose former pride had crumbled into panic. She clutched her silk scarf in her lap, lips trembling as she searched for words, but none would come. Robert Hayes, the seasoned captain, felt a cold sweat trail down his neck. In more than 3 decades in aviation, he had faced engine malfunctions, fainting passengers, even violent storms. Yet never had he felt so completely in the wrong as in this moment. He had nearly forced a rightful passenger off the plane, driven solely by his own unconscious bias. Ethan Cole still stood tall, shoulders straight, calm in a way that unsettled the air around him. His eyes flicked down at Susan's boarding pass, a brief flash of contempt passing across his face before disappearing. Inside, years of buried indignation swelled like a foreball ready to erupt. Then his phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. 3 familiar words appeared. Thomas Brennan. No one else in the cabin knew who Thomas was, but to Ethan, he was the long-time ally, the CEO of Skylink Airlines, the very carrier in which Ethan held controlling shares. Ethan answered, not to his ear but on speaker. His voice was calm, resonant, carrying to every corner of the cabin. "Hello, Tom." A ripple of surprise spread through the rows. Passengers leaned forward. Sarah Miller, the young flight attendant, went pale, her fingers gripping the seat for support. David Harmon stiffened, his heartbeat pounding. On the other end came a commanding voice. "Ethan, I just got an emergency alert. The system shows Flight 1947 delayed more than 30 minutes. Your name is flagged as involved. What's going on?" Robert Hayes froze. He knew that voice well. It belonged to the ultimate authority, a man whose single phone call could shatter his career. Ethan lifted his gaze, letting it sweep across the cabin of stunned faces. His reply was steady, each word deliberate. "Tom, for the past 30 minutes your crew has tried to remove me from the seat I purchased. They chose to believe a blatant lie instead of taking the simplest step of all, checking the boarding pass. And when I refused to give up my seat, they threatened to call security to drag me off." The words echoed through the cabin, a heavy indictment falling on the entire crew. A deadly silence followed. Then Thomas Brennan's voice cut through, sharp and surgical. "Excuse me. Did I hear you correctly? Did you just say they tried to eject Ethan Cole, chairman of Reed Global Aviation, majority shareholder of Skylink, from his rightful seat?" The cabin shook with the weight of revelation. Passengers' mouths fell open. They turned to Ethan, eyes wide in disbelief. The man they had dismissed, judged, and insulted simply for his modest appearance was revealed as the one who held the power to decide the very future of this airline. Susan Drake went ashen, her body stiff as ice. Sarah and David both gasped, blood draining from their faces. Robert Hayes stumbled back, as if the floor itself had given way beneath him. Ethan tilted his head, his gaze sweeping coldly through the cabin. He did not raise his voice, yet his tone rang like iron. "I am not asking for privilege. I am not demanding favor. I am demanding fairness. But today, you chose another path. Bias, prejudice, and humiliation. And now, everyone here will witness the consequences." The cabin held still, not a soul daring to move. Only the rush of air against the fuselage and the pounding of hearts filled the silence. In that instant, Ethan knew the curtain had fallen. His true power was revealed. And from this moment forward, nothing could stop the storm he was about to unleash upon the entire system. First class sank into silence after Thomas Brennan's introduction. Every passenger seemed spellbound, their eyes fixed on Ethan Cole, the man they had dismissed just minutes earlier, now revealed as a force no one dared to cross. Robert Hayes swallowed hard, his throat dry. In 3 decades at the controls, he had faced engine fires, storms tearing across the sky, even unruly passengers. But never had he felt his career hanging by such a fragile thread. Ethan lifted the phone closer, his voice calm yet cutting. "Tom, I want you to hear me clearly. Flight 11847, I am officially invoking Protocol 7. All operations of this flight are frozen until a civil rights investigation is conducted." The cabin gasped. The words Protocol 7 struck like thunder. Passengers whispered nervously. The crew stood rigid. Thomas Brennan did not hesitate. "Understood. I will inform the board immediately. Ethan, stay in contact. From this moment, all decisions are yours." The call ended. Ethan slipped the phone into his jacket pocket and raised his gaze, eyes flashing like steel. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice rang through the cabin, "this flight is no longer ordinary. It is living evidence of blatant prejudice and bias, and I will not allow it to be buried like thousands of incidents before it." Sarah Miller felt her legs tremble. She had once believed that a polite smile and a few soothing words could smooth over any conflict. But now, she was swept into the center of a storm. David Harmon was pale, sweat dripping down his temple, his tie suddenly strangling his throat. Robert Hayes tried to reclaim authority. "Mr. Cole, as captain, Ethan cut him off, voice like cold iron. "Captain Hayes, you are no longer the sole authority on this aircraft. You threatened to expel a paying passenger to appease a lie. That act is recorded on every system in this cabin, and it will be released." The cabin shuddered. Several passengers raised their phones, recording. Tiny lights flashed, illuminating the stunned faces of the crew. Susan Drake tried to interject, her voice shaky with fear, but still clinging to arrogance. This was just a misunderstanding. Ethan's gaze sliced through her words. "Mrs. Drake, you sat in a seat that was not yours. You exploited bias to claim an advantage. And when exposed, you blamed others and painted me as a threat. You have lived by privilege. But today, that privilege ends." Susan froze, trembling from head to toe. In the eyes of the passengers, the once elegant woman had become nothing more than a deceitful fraud. Ethan drew a deep breath and pulled out his work phone, the one reserved for emergencies. He dialed, his voice firm and decisive. "Julia, activate Level 1 Crisis Protocol. Instruct the entire Reed Global Aviation System to monitor Flight 1847. Immediately collect passenger statements, crew communications, and release a preliminary report within 24 hours." On the other end, Julia Martinez, COO of the corporation, replied, "Understood. It will be deployed at once." The cabin erupted in murmurs. Some passengers' eyes gleamed, realizing they were witnessing history. Others sat in silence, faces burning with shame as they remembered the whispers they had uttered earlier. Robert Hayes lowered his shoulders and bowed his head. He knew his 30-year career had collapsed in less than half an hour. David Harmon choked back a sob. Sarah Miller covered her mouth to muffle her cries. Ethan turned back, his voice resonant, warm yet commanding. Justice never arrives on its own. It requires someone to stand, even against the crowd. Today, I have done my part. From here, history will finish the rest. Outside, the Boeing still sat motionless on the runway. But inside every heart, they knew. This flight had been frozen, not just because of a seat, but because of a truth that had been exposed and would shake the skies forever. No one in first class dared to breathe. Flight 1847 still sat motionless on the runway, but inside, the air churned like a gathering storm. Every pair of eyes was fixed on Ethan Cole, the man who had just turned a seat dispute into an indictment of an entire system. Robert Hayes, the captain, bowed his head. Shoulders once carried with pride now felt weighed down like stone. Ethan's sharp words still echoed in his ears. "Captain Hayes, from this moment you are no longer the only one giving orders on this plane." 3 decades of career, reputation, and honors now threatened to vanish because he had chosen the wrong side. David Harmon, the chief purser, trembled as he adjusted his tie. Once so confident in his art of persuasion, turning lies into truth with a steady voice, now he was exposed before hundreds of witnesses, each camera phone recording his collapse. Sarah Miller's face, usually stretched into a rehearsed smile, was twisted with panic. She could not meet Ethan's eyes. Shame gnawed at her veins. She had let prejudice guide her, and now everyone could see it. Susan Drake, the center of the storm, clutched the armrest of seat 1A so tightly her nails dug into the soft leather. The boarding pass marked 14F was now a permanent stain on the reputation she had built her whole life. Her skin was pale, sweat dripping down her temples. But what terrified her most was not losing a seat. It was losing face, losing power, losing the protective mask of an elite passenger that had shielded her for so long. A voice rose from the back rows. A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and eyes sharp as steel spoke coldly. "We've been waiting half an hour because she stole someone else's seat. This is disgraceful." An older woman in row 3 followed, her voice shaky but resolute. "I've flown with this airline for years. Never have I seen such blatant favoritism. If Mr. Cole weren't here, they would have thrown out the rightful passenger." The words sliced through the silence like a blade. Murmurs surged through the cabin. Some passengers nodded. Others raised their phones higher, recording the faces of the crew. Ethan stood tall, his back straight like a fortress wall. He did not shout. He did not rage. His calm silence made him the absolute center of the cabin. Then he spoke, voice steady and firm. "You have all seen it with your own eyes. This is not a minor mistake. This is the symptom of a disease that runs deep. Discrimination, privilege, and contempt for fairness. I will not allow this to be buried like thousands of times before." Robert lifted his head, ready to justify himself. But Ethan's gaze silenced him. Sarah whispered a faint apology no one heard. David kept his head down, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the pen in his pocket. Susan, unwilling to surrender, sprang from her seat, her voice shrill. "You cannot destroy me over a ticket. I am a loyal customer." "I have the right. Your rights ended the moment you lied." Ethan cut her off, his voice sharp as a blade. Applause suddenly broke out from the business-class cabin. A young black woman, still holding up her phone as it recorded, stood and said, "Mr. Cole, thank you for not staying silent. We need someone strong enough to speak the truth so many of us have endured." The applause spread. Some hesitated, then joined in. Soon the sound of clapping filled the cabin, drowning out Susan's ragged breath, drowning out the trembling of the crew. Ethan gave a slight nod, his eyes softening for a brief moment. He knew this moment was not just for him. It was for everyone who had ever been forced into silence, pushed aside. Yet deep down, he also knew this was only the beginning. The true storm, the investigations, the collapse of careers once thought untouchable, and the shock waves across the industry still lay ahead. Out on the runway, the Boeing remained still. But inside the hearts of those aboard, the flight had already soared far beyond its limits. It had become living proof of a simple truth. Sometimes, all it takes is one person refusing to leave the seat they deserve, and the whole world must change. Just minutes after Ethan Cole ordered the activation of Protocol 7, the entire aviation system began to quake. Red emergency codes flashed across the central operations screen at Skylink's Atlanta Command Center. Alarm lights blazed, sirens blared. Flight 1847 was officially marked. Frozen civil rights investigation. At headquarters, senior executives poured out of boardrooms like a hive torn open. Phones pressed to their ears, faces drained pale as the words echoed through every corridor. One of our largest shareholders, the chairman of Reed Global Aviation, discriminated against by our crew on his own airline. The news spread like lightning, shattering the wall of pride the company had built over decades. Inside first class, passengers realized they were witnessing history. Fingers flew over phones, videos posted to Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. Within minutes, hashtags #Seat1A and Equality in the Air shot to the top of trending lists. Across America, outrage exploded. Susan Drake sat frozen, her face bloodless. Her phone buzzed endlessly, calls from lawyers, partners, clients. She dared not answer. She knew one viral clip would erase her reputation forever. Robert Hayes slumped in a crew chair, head in his hands. In his mind, he saw tomorrow's headlines. Veteran captain suspended after threatening major shareholder. 30 years of career could vanish in one moment of bias. David Harmon and Sarah Miller leaned against the wall, trembling. No longer proud crew of a flagship airline, in the eyes of passengers they were conspirators, twisting rules to defend false privilege. Ethan remained standing, face calm, but in his eyes burned a cold fire. This was the moment he had waited for, the moment to force the system to confront itself. He pulled out his work phone again, his voice carrying through the cabin, clear and firm. "Julia, Release the press statement within 1 hour. Send every passenger's video, every piece of evidence, to the media. The message is simple. Skylink Airlines committed a grave civil rights violation on Flight 1947. The board must understand this crisis cannot be hidden. On the other end, COO Julia Martinez responded instantly. Understood, Ethan. Global media will know within 30 minutes. The cabin rippled with shock. A young passenger whispered, "My God, he's not just a businessman. He's teaching the entire airline industry a lesson." The words spread quickly, turning into quiet respect. Eyes that once judged him stubborn now glowed with admiration. They knew that without Ethan, the truth would have been buried, and the liar rewarded. Suddenly, Susan jumped to her feet, her voice shrill. "This is defamation! You have no right! I will sue! I will!" Martinez, the young security officer, cut her off, voice firm. "Mrs. Drake, you sat in the wrong seat, deceived the crew, and disrupted this flight. You will return to your assigned seat in 14F. You will also be cited as soon as we land." Soft laughter rose among the passengers. For the first time, Susan's false power crumbled completely. Shaking, she lowered her head, packed her bag, and shuffled away. Passing Ethan, she felt his cold gaze slice through her like a blade. She knew her career, her image as a powerful attorney, had ended in this very cabin. Ethan turned back to the passengers, his voice strong yet warm. "You have witnessed this. This is not just my story. This is a test for everyone. When fairness is trampled, will you stay silent or will you stand up?" Applause erupted. First scattered, then swelling, rolling through the cabin. The clapping was not just for Ethan, but for the truth finally pulled into the light. Outside, the sun sank behind the Los Angeles runway, painting the Boeing in crimson twilight. Inside, everyone knew. This was only the beginning. The shockwaves of this moment would shake the entire industry to its core. News spread faster than any Boeing could fly. While Flight 1947 still sat motionless on the runway, the global media had already erupted. The image of Susan Drake arguing, Ethan Cole demanding fairness, and the moment Officer Martinez read aloud, "Seat 14F, economy class," appeared on thousands of phone screens. At Skylink headquarters, executives rushed into emergency meetings amid chaos. The first reports came in. Robert Hayes, the veteran captain, was suspended from flying immediately. Lawyers were examining whether he had violated federal civil rights laws. David Harmon, the chief purser, was fired within hours. The video of him mocking and pressuring Ethan to give up his seat spread rapidly across the internet. Sarah Miller, the young flight attendant, was suspended without pay, ordered into mandatory investigation and bias training. Everything happened like a torrent. The very people who once stood arrogantly in first class now became the faces of a broken system. At the law firm where Susan was a senior partner, phones rang non-stop. Clients sent mass emails cancelling contracts, demanding explanations. The press published wave after wave of stories. Corporate ethics attorney Susan Drake caught in blatant deception on Flight 1947. On Twitter, the hashtag #seat14F exploded. A photo of Susan's boarding pass became a global symbol of brazen privilege. Within 48 hours, Susan was suspended. Her law firm announced an internal investigation for actions causing severe professional reputational harm. Decades of career collapsed in an instant. In the boardroom, CEO Thomas Brennan was forced to issue a public statement. Skylink Airlines will fully cooperate with federal authorities in the investigation. We deeply apologize to Chairman Ethan Cole and all passengers. But the apology came too late to stop the outrage. The Department of Transportation and the Federal Aviation Administration both opened investigations. Congress convened a special hearing on discrimination in aviation. Minority shareholders began dumping Skylink stock, fearful of the company's plunging value. The media dubbed it the Seat 1A crisis, the greatest airline scandal of the decade. From his glass-walled office in Los Angeles, Ethan Cole watched it all unfold. Sunset spread across the distant runways. He felt no glee, only a cold composure. He understood. This was not a personal victory. It was proof for millions who had suffered injustice in silence. Ethan signed the final document, the creation of the Air Travel Equality Foundation. Funded by compensation payouts and resources from Reed Global Aviation, it would provide legal aid for passengers facing discrimination. At the first press conference, when a reporter asked how he felt about being at the center of a global firestorm, Ethan simply smiled. "I only did what any passenger has the right to do, sit in the seat I paid for. But if I must use my power to force the system to change, I will not hesitate. This is not about me. This is about fairness for everyone." To the public, Ethan Cole was no longer just a quiet businessman. He had become a symbol, a man who turned humiliation into a torch that lit up an entire industry. On social media, tens of thousands of passengers shared their own stories of being dismissed or pushed out of their rightful seats. For the first time, they felt their voices were heard. As for Susan, Robert, David, and Sarah, the names once synonymous with professionalism, they now lived on only as bitterer examples in training manuals. How a single seat can bring down an entire system. Ethan sat at his office window, gazing out at the airport glowing like a city of lights. In his heart echoed a simple truth. Real power does not lie in the massive machines taking off outside, but in the courage of a person who says, "I will not leave the seat I deserve." 3 months after the Seat 1A crisis, the bright lights of the 60-minute studio shone down on the calm yet resolute face of Ethan Cole. Behind him, a large screen replayed the historic moment. Susan Drake exposed with a boarding pass marked Seat 14F. The entire first-class cabin frozen in silence. The host leaned toward him. "Mr. Cole, millions want to know, why didn't you just accept another seat? It was only a chair." Ethan drew in a deep breath. His voice was steady, warm, yet resounding. It was never just a chair. It was dignity. Every time we surrender to injustice just to keep the peace, we feed a system that survives on silence. And I decided silence is no longer an option. The camera panned to the wall behind him, covered with dozens of thank you letters, from teachers, nurses, factory workers, students, all people who had once felt diminished, but after that incident, found new courage to demand fairness. Ethan continued, each word cutting through the air like an arrow. We cannot allow justice to become a luxury reserved for the few. We cannot let a so-called reasonable solution always mean the victim must sacrifice. Justice is not negotiable. Dignity is not a privilege. And that seat, 1A, or any seat, belongs to the person who paid for it, fair and square. The studio audience fell silent. Some nodded in agreement. Others wept quietly. On live broadcast, millions felt the weight of every word. Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes fixed on the camera. I do not seek to be a symbol. I only want to leave this message. When you stand up for yourself, you stand up for thousands of others. When you hold on to the seat you deserve, you protect fairness for the generations to come. The music swelled. The scene shifted to the office of the Air Travel Equality Foundation. On the wall, Susan's boarding pass for seat 14F hung framed, a solemn reminder that truth always surfaces. Reporters narrated, in its first week, the foundation received hundreds of calls, helping passengers successfully sue other airlines. A wave of reform surged across the industry. Mandatory training programs, independent oversight committees, compensation funds for victims. Back in the studio, Ethan gave his closing words, his voice gentle but ringing like a bell across the airwaves. Remember this, the most powerful seat is not in first class. It is on the moral ground where you stand. Never give up the place you deserve. Because sometimes, one refusal of injustice can change the world. The camera zoomed slowly onto his face, eyes steady, filled with hope. The lights dimmed, but his message echoed still. Justice does not come by itself. It comes when someone dares to rise. In this world, there are moments that may seem small, a simple refusal, a single seat, but they can be powerful enough to shake an entire system. Ethan Cole proved that justice is not a gift to be granted, but an inherent right. And to protect it, sometimes all it takes is one simple act, refusing to leave the place you deserve. If this story resonates with you, hit like to spread the message, subscribe to join us on the journeys ahead, and in the comments, write exactly 2 words, stay strong. Because change does not come from silence. It begins with you, with the decision not to back down in the face of injustice, even if it happens on nothing more than an airplane seat.